Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, Malta. You are underground in Malta, 60 feet below the surface, inside a temple carved entirely from limestone, using nothing but stone tools. There is no natural light. The air is still and cold and smells of rock and something older. A woman stands in a carved alcove set into the wall, its ceiling curved like the inside of a skull. She speaks. What happens next is why this site has been restricted since researchers understood what they had found. When she speaks, the walls answer. Not in echo, not in reflection, the walls themselves vibrate. You feel it first in your chest, then behind your eyes, then in the bones behind your ears. The sound seems to come from everywhere and from inside you simultaneously. Your sense of direction dissolves. Your critical thinking begins to slow. You are not frightened, exactly. You are something beyond frightened. You are being chemically altered by architecture. In 1902, construction workers digging cisterns beneath a residential building in Paola, a suburb of Valletta, broke through the floor and fell into darkness below. What waited for them was a carved underground temple spreading across 3 levels, its chambers connected by passages so deliberately designed that the workers initially believed they had found a natural cave system. It was not. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni was made entirely by human hands, carved from limestone between approximately 4000 and 2500 BCE, among the oldest fully artificial underground structures on Earth. Archaeological excavation produced the remains of approximately 7,000 human beings, 7,000, in 3 underground levels, predominantly female. The mainstream interpretation held for decades. Sacred burial site, religious complex. The alcove in the lowest level was an oracle chamber where a priestess projected her voice using the limestone's resonant properties, natural, explainable. And then, in 2008, research scientist Paolo De Bertolis and acoustic engineer Niccolo Bisconti arrived with measuring equipment and changed what we thought we understood about this place. The oracle chamber resonates at exactly 111 Hz, confirmed by multiple research teams, changing any dimension of the chamber, its depth, its width, the curve of its ceiling, by even a small amount would shift the resonant frequency away from that value. The builders of the hypogeum, working with stone tools 4,000 to 6,000 years before the scientific measurement of sound frequencies, carved an acoustic cavity that vibrates at 111 Hz and not at any other value. This requires knowing, in advance, what 111 Hz produces in the human body, because 111 Hz is not a random number. It sits at the precise boundary between alpha and theta brainwave activity in the human nervous system. Theta waves are associated with deep relaxation bordering on unconsciousness, hypnagogic states, reduced rational filtering, and experiences that subjects consistently describe as visions or direct communication with external presences. Sustained exposure to 111 Hz, documented in multiple modern neuroscience studies, measurably alters brain electrical activity in ways that impair critical thinking, enhance emotional suggestibility, and produce states indistinguishable from certain forms of religious experience. This is not metaphysics. It is documented neuroscience. The oracle chamber of the hypogeum has been producing this for 5,000 years. De Bertolis documented a further effect. When sound is produced in the oracle chamber, it does not stay there. It travels through the rock itself, through the walls and floors and ceilings of all 3 underground levels. Researchers far from the oracle chamber reported feeling the resonance physically, vibrations in the sternum, pressure behind the eyes, a sensation of sound arriving through the floor rather than through the air. One researcher described it as hearing sound with your whole skeleton rather than your ears. Sustained at 111 Hz, underground, in total darkness, surrounded by the remains of 7,000 other human beings. The hypogeum was not primarily a place of burial. It was a machine for producing a specific state of consciousness in specific people. And then there is the detail that has no mainstream explanation. The 111 Hz effect is gender-specific. When a woman's voice projects into the oracle chamber, it resonates throughout the complex. When a man's voice does the same, it does not. Male vocal frequencies do not activate the resonance. The hypogeum was tuned for women's voices exclusively. 7,000 remains, predominantly female. A consciousness alteration facility built to respond only to women, filled with the bodies of women, carved into the earth below a civilization that vanished without successors around 2500 BCE and left no written explanation for any of it. Access has been restricted since the 1990s. Researchers who spent extended time inside before restrictions were imposed reported visions, lasting disorientation, and in some cases nothing unusual at all. The inconsistency is exactly what theta range induction research predicts. The response is probabilistic. The builders knew this. They built it anyway, used it for centuries, sealed it, and disappeared. Why does the chamber resonate at exactly 111 Hz when any variation in its carved dimensions would change that value? Why does the resonance only activate for women's voices? What were the 7,000 people who ended up inside this complex experiencing before they died? And what did the builders of the hypogeum understand about the human nervous system that neuroscience has only confirmed in the last 50 years? Number 2. Rosslyn Chapel, Scotland. From Malta's ancient underground, we travel north to Scotland, to a medieval chapel, where a century-old mystery was decoded in the 21st century using a scientific principle that did not formally exist when the mystery was created. Walk into Rosslyn Chapel, built between 1440 and 1490 by William Sinclair, 1st Earl of Caithness, and your eye goes immediately to the carved stone pillars, the vegetation climbing every surface, the faces emerging from the walls, the intricate altarpieces. These are what gets photographed. These are what tour guides describe. For 500 years, these were what historians wrote about. But look up. Running along the interior arches above the nave, attached to the stone in rows, are 213 carved cubes projecting from the arch surfaces. Each cube has a distinct geometric pattern on its face. Not vines, not faces, not religious iconography, geometric patterns, grids, nested circles, triangles, interlocking arcs. For 500 years, nobody asked what they were. They were assumed to be decorative. They were categorized as medieval ornament and quietly ignored by every serious researcher who entered the building. Thomas Mitchell was a retired schoolteacher with no formal training in acoustics. In 2005, examining the cubes closely, he noticed the patterns reminded him of something he could not name. Months of searching reference books later, he found it. The patterns resembled Chladni figures. Ernst Chladni was an 18th century physicist who discovered that bowing a sand-covered metal plate produces precise geometric patterns in the sand. Different frequencies produce different patterns. The shapes are mathematically exact and perfectly reproducible. The same frequency always produces the same shape because the shape is determined by wave physics, not by the sand. The shapes Chladni documented in 1787 look, at the scale of a stone carving, exactly like complex geometric ornamental work, which is what Thomas Mitchell had been staring at in a chapel completed 3 centuries before Chladni was born. Thomas Mitchell brought his finding to his son Stuart, a professional composer. Stuart spent 20 years cross-referencing the 213 cubes against Chladni figure archives, working from the premise that each pattern encoded a musical pitch based on which frequency's sand figure would produce that specific shape. In 2007, he performed the result publicly as the Rosslyn Motet, played on medieval instruments. Whether his specific decoding is completely correct is disputed. What is not disputed is what acoustic physicists unaffiliated with Mitchell's project found when they examined specific cubes independently. Particular cubes produce patterns with correspondence to known Chladni signatures that exceeds what geometric coincidence would produce. The patterns on some Rosslyn cubes are physically specific in a way that purely decorative medieval stonework is not. Mainstream historians have maintained a cautious position. Medieval craftsmen working in stone developed geometric design vocabularies that naturally intersect with mathematical forms. The human mind finds patterns in complexity. Stuart Mitchell's decoding is one of many possible readings of an ambiguous dataset. No contemporary document from 1440 confirms that the cubes encode music. No letter, no inventory, no inscription. Identifies 213 acoustic cipher cubes among the chapel's features. The resemblance to Chladni figures may be a sophisticated case of pattern recognition overreach, but Chladni figures are not generally geometric. This is what the mainstream critique consistently misses. They are produced by specific wave physics, and they are exact. The shapes are not approximately similar across different frequencies. They are categorically distinct, with specific mathematical properties that do not occur in arbitrary geometric decoration. When a pattern on a Rosslyn cube corresponds to a known Chladni figure, the match is not approximate. It is either correct or it is not. And some of the matches confirmed by independent acoustic physicists are correct in a way that is not attributable to coincidence. And then there is William Sinclair himself. He was Grand Master of the Scottish Templars. The Templars spent nearly a decade excavating beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem during the Crusades. What they found there, what knowledge they encountered in the ancient libraries, scholarly traditions, and sacred geometries of the Middle East, was carried back to Europe and largely kept within the order. Some of it evidently reached Scotland and was encoded in the ceiling of a chapel using a cipher based on acoustic resonance physics that European natural philosophy would not formally describe for 3 more centuries. The frequencies associated with the decoded Rosslyn cubes, to the extent they can be confirmed, appear in ancient musical traditions predating the medieval church, including tonal systems documented in Egyptian temple music, and in the solfeggio frequency system, whose origins remain disputed, but whose presence spans multiple ancient cultures independently. Why would William Sinclair, after 50 years of construction, leave 213 stone ciphers in his ceiling that no one would be able to read for 3 centuries? What knowledge was important enough to encode in stone rather than write in a document? Who, in Jerusalem or before Jerusalem, taught him to translate sound into geometry? And what else came back from the Temple Mount that is still waiting for someone to measure it? Number 3. Chavin de Huantar, Peru. From Scotland's cryptically carved chapel, we cross the Atlantic and climb 10,000 feet into the Peruvian Andes, where an underground stone labyrinth was designed not just to create sound, but to surgically disable your ability to locate it. You are underground. The passage is narrow, 3 feet wide, and the ceiling presses 6 feet above you. The rock is close on all sides, cold and faintly damp against your hands when you touch the walls. There is no light except what you carry. Somewhere ahead of you, or behind you, or to the left, you hear water. Not dripping, moving, somewhere, a subterranean flow that you can hear clearly but cannot find. You turn toward it. It seems to shift. You walk. It recedes. You stop walking. It stops. You move again. It moves with you, maintaining exactly the same relationship of just out of reach. In the dark, pressed between stone walls 10,000 feet above sea level in the Andes, the water sounds like something breathing in the same room as you, something that knows when you move. You are inside Chavin de Huantar. Built between 900 and 200 BCE in Peru's Mosna River Valley. From the surface, the site presents as a typical pre-Columbian ceremonial complex. Sunken circular plazas, stone platforms, terraced architecture facing a sunken court. But beneath the surface structures runs an interconnected maze of underground galleries, carved from granite and limestone, branching and intersecting at angles and depths that make intuitive navigation impossible. The experience of the water you can hear, but cannot find, is not a random feature of the rock. It is the entire design intent of the space. Miriam Kolar, affiliated with Stanford University, began studying the gallery acoustics in 2008. Her findings published from 2013 documented acoustic masking. The human brain locates sound using the fractional difference in arrival time at each ear. This triangulation fails in environments where multiple simultaneous reflection paths deliver the same sound from every direction within milliseconds. Inside the Chavin galleries, stone walls create precisely this condition. The triangulation mechanism breaks down completely and does not recover while you remain in the space. Kolar conducted controlled experiments at the site. Participants were asked to identify sound sources played from fixed positions they had visually confirmed before entering the dark. They could not identify the sources. Not approximately, not at all. Their directional hearing had been switched off by the architecture. Kolar also documented the instruments, 2 Strombus shell trumpets excavated from the site, producing tones from 60 to 100 Hz. Played inside the galleries, these frequencies create standing waves, felt as physical pressure against the skin. The gallery dimensions, including ceiling height and junction angles, appear selected to maximize resonance at exactly these frequency ranges. Every structural decision about the galleries has acoustic consequences that correspond to the instruments buried inside them. There is also the San Pedro cactus. Archaeological evidence of San Pedro use at Chavin de Huantar is well documented. San Pedro contains mescaline, a serotonergic compound that at ceremonial doses produces altered visual perception, dissolution of the boundary between self and environment, and a profound intensification of sensory input including sound. Mescaline at the right dose makes you hear every sound as though it were the most important sound you have ever heard. Combined with acoustic masking at 60 to 100 Hz, in total darkness underground, with standing waves producing physical pressure against your skin from all directions. The result is an experience that no participant could distinguish from contact with a non-human intelligence. The mainstream interpretation of Chavin de Huantar treats all of this as intentional, ceremonial design. Acoustic effects were deliberately engineered to enhance initiatory religious experience. This is, notably, not a skeptical position. Mainstream Andean archaeology grants full intentionality to the acoustic engineering of the Chavin galleries. What it does not address is the how. To engineer a gallery system that creates reproducible acoustic masking, you need to predict in advance how sound will behave in an enclosed space you have not finished building yet. You need to understand wave reflection physics in stone corridors of specific dimensions. You need to know that a junction at a particular angle will scatter reflections in a pattern that disables directional hearing at a particular frequency. This is not intuitive knowledge, and it is not learnable through trial and error, because you cannot test whether an underground gallery successfully disorients sound until after you have finished carving it. The commitment to a design decision is made before any feedback is possible. The builders of Chavin de Huantar were doing this in 900 BCE in the Andes. What knowledge base existed at that place and time that made this possible? And why, if you possess that engineering knowledge, would its only known application be in the dark underground, where the only witnesses to what you had achieved were people whose ability to think clearly about it had been deliberately switched off? Number 4. The King's Chamber, Great Pyramid of Giza, Egypt. From the Peruvian Andes, we return to Egypt, not to its famous temples or painted tombs, but to the interior of the most analyzed structure on Earth, where researchers working in the 1990s found something that Egyptology still does not have a satisfying category for. Lie down inside the granite sarcophagus in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid. The lid has been missing since antiquity. You are in a precisely cut box of Aswan granite, 6 feet 8 inches long, 2 feet 3 inches wide, weighing 3 tons. Someone outside strikes the chamber wall once with an open hand. What returns is not an echo. The entire room vibrates. You feel it in your back through the granite beneath you, then in your sternum, then in the bones of your skull in a way distinct from any sound you have heard through the air. Acoustic researcher John Reed measured this frequency. The fundamental resonant frequency of the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid of Giza is 111 Hz. 111 Hz. Take a moment with that. The oracle chamber, carved into the lowest level of the hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta, built between 4000 and 2500 BCE, resonates at exactly 111 Hz. The King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, built around 2500 BCE and located 2,000 miles away on a different continent, resonates at exactly 111 Hz. Two structures, two civilizations, two separate millennia, the same frequency. The frequency documented by modern neuroscience to sit at the boundary of theta brainwave activity, the state associated with reduced critical thinking, altered consciousness, and experiences described consistently across cultures as contact with presences beyond the ordinary. The probability of two independent ancient cultures separately arriving at this same precise resonant frequency by accident in structures both devoted to ceremonial or sacred use is low enough that coincidence is not a satisfying explanation. Reed's research documented additional properties of the chamber beyond its fundamental resonance. The granite walls vibrate sympathetically when specific tones are produced inside the room. The chamber responds to certain frequencies and absorbs others. The dimensions of the space, approximately 6.5 feet wide by 17 feet long by 19 feet tall, create a standing wave environment where specific acoustic nodes and antinodes are fixed in particular positions. Standing in one area of the chamber produces a measurably different acoustic experience than standing 3 feet away. The sarcophagus itself, empty and open, resonates when a vocal tone in the range of F-sharp is sustained by a person standing inside it. The granite vibrates sympathetically, and the full-body physical sensation of that resonance persists, according to multiple researchers who have undergone the experience, for a perceptible moment after the voice stops. The stone seems to hold the sound for one breath after the source goes quiet. Nothing about the king's chamber was accidental. The 100-ton granite ceiling beams came from Aswan, 500 miles away, transported without iron tools or wheels. Above the king's chamber, 5 additional stone spaces called relieving chambers exist, each built from equally massive granite. The mainstream explanation is structural load distribution. Engineers who have modeled the actual forces note that solid fill would distribute them comparably. The 5 chambers above are not clearly necessary for structural integrity. They exist for a reason engineering alone does not explain. The pyramid is oriented to true north within 0.05 degrees. Engineer Christopher Dunn has argued in a body of published work beginning in the 1990s that the internal chambers of the Great Pyramid form a coupled resonator system in which the Queen's Chamber, the Grand Gallery, and the King's Chamber are components of a vibrational mechanism rather than a burial sequence. In Dunn's model, the sarcophagus is not a coffin. It is a resonance coupler, a vessel whose internal dimensions create a standing wave that matches and amplifies the chamber's fundamental frequency at 111 Hz. Its exact specifications, which match no pharaonic burial tradition in their proportions or their complete absence of inscription or decoration, are engineering tolerances, not funerary preferences. Dunn's model has not achieved mainstream acceptance, and no peer-reviewed consensus endorses it, but it predicts specific acoustic behaviors of the chamber that subsequent measurement has confirmed. And it is the only published model that explains, in consistent terms, why the sarcophagus dimensions are what they are and why the chamber sounds the way it does. 2 rooms, on opposite sides of the Mediterranean, built by separate civilizations in separate millennia, resonating at the same precise frequency. The pyramid is oriented to true north within 0.05 degrees of accuracy. Nothing about it was careless. What knowledge links the Malta of 3000 BCE to the Egypt of 2500 BCE across 2,000 miles of sea? Who, on both sides of that water, understood the human nervous system well enough to engineer the frequency of altered consciousness into stone? Number 5. El Castillo Pyramid, Chichén Itzá, Mexico. From the Great Pyramid's resonant granite chambers, we cross the Atlantic and land in the Yucatan Peninsula, where a well-documented acoustic phenomenon, at one of the world's most visited sites, has still not been given a satisfying explanation by the people responsible for the site. Stand at the base of El Castillo, the step pyramid of Chichén Itzá, 98 feet of pale limestone tapering toward a temple platform. Clap your hands once, sharply, like a gunshot. Then listen to what returns from the pyramid face. It is not your clap. It is a rising chirp, a sound that climbs in frequency over about half a second. Researchers who first recorded it assumed it was a recording artifact, something wrong with the equipment. Then they compared the chirp to something else. The sound coming back from El Castillo is almost exactly the call of the resplendent quetzal. The resplendent quetzal is a bird whose long iridescent tail feathers were worth more than gold in ancient Maya trade networks, and whose call is a rising trill that ancient Mesoamerican cultures identified as the voice of the divine. It is the sacred bird of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent deity whose name El Castillo carries. The pyramid built in honor of the feathered serpent deity converts handclaps into the sound of the feathered serpent's sacred bird and reflects it back at whoever is standing at the pyramid's base. This acoustic effect was not documented by researchers until 1998. Acoustic physicist David Lubman stood at El Castillo's northern staircase in 1998, clapped, and recognized the return as anomalous. Back in his laboratory, spectrogram analysis of the recording showed a clear frequency sweep rising over the duration of the echo. Compared against a spectrogram of a recorded quetzal call, the shapes matched. The specific rise rate of the frequency sweep, its total duration, and the frequency range it covered corresponded to the acoustic signature of the quetzal's call in ways that exceeded coincidence. Lubman presented his findings to the Acoustical Society of America, peer-reviewed and accepted. The El Castillo echo is real, reproducible, and has no accepted mainstream explanation for its resemblance to a Quetzal call. The physics of what is happening involves Bragg scattering. The staircase on El Castillo's northern face has risers, the vertical face of each step, at regular intervals of approximately 1 foot. When a sharp, impulsive sound like a handclap reaches the staircase, each riser reflects a small portion of the sound's energy back toward the listener. Because the risers are evenly spaced, each reflected portion returns at a slightly later moment than the previous one. The total sound energy does not arrive back as a single sharp return. It arrives spread across time, with different frequency components arriving at different moments, which the ear perceives as a frequency sweep, a chirp. The specific dimensions of El Castillo's risers produce a sweep in the rising direction that matches the Quetzal's call. The staircase is, acoustically, a frequency filter that deconstructs a sharp, impulsive input into a specific bird's song. The mainstream position is that this is an elegant, accidental byproduct of the staircase geometry. The risers are the dimensions they are for structural reasons. The acoustic chirp emerges without having been planned. The resemblance to the Quetzal's call is a striking coincidence, or perhaps a case of humans finding meaningful patterns in ambiguous acoustic data. No inscription at Chichén Itzá describes an intentional acoustic effect, but consider precisely what this requires you to accept as coincidental. The Maya at Chichén Itzá were astronomically and mathematically sophisticated enough to align El Castillo so that on each spring and autumn equinox, the shadow pattern of the pyramid's stepped corners falls along the balustrade of the northern staircase in a precise, undulating form that replicates the image of a feathered serpent descending to earth. This is Kukulkan descending. It requires exact knowledge of solar angles at this latitude, exact orientation of the structure, and exact design of the staircase profile relative to the pyramid's stepped edges. They built an optical event into stone and scheduled it twice a year. On that same northern staircase, the risers are at the spacing required to convert percussion sounds into the call of Kukulkan's sacred bird. Researcher Olin Tejeda, who followed Lubman's work, proposed that during large ceremonies at El Castillo, with musicians and chanters assembled at the pyramid base, the northern staircase converted their instruments into the voice of the feathered serpent god, echoing back from the stone. The pyramid was not merely dedicated to Kukulkan. Struck at the right moment with the right sound, it spoke back in his bird's voice. How did Maya architects produce a staircase that replicates a specific bird's call without formal knowledge of acoustic wave physics? Can the civilization that engineered a twice-yearly serpent of light and shadow on this same staircase be plausibly credited with an accidental Quetzal? And what other messages are encoded in stone at Maya sites that we are walking past without listening for the reply? Number 6. Newgrange, Ireland. From the Yucatan Peninsula, we leap across the Atlantic to Ireland, to a structure 4,000 years older than El Castillo, where researchers arrived with drums in the late 1990s and discovered that the builders understood something about how sound behaves in enclosed stone spaces that formal acoustic science only caught up to in the 20th century. December 21st. The winter solstice. You are inside a passage tomb in County Meath, Ireland, and it is 3200 BCE. The structure surrounding you has been standing for perhaps a generation. The chamber you stand in is corbelled stone, circular, with a domed ceiling built from slabs that overlap inward toward the top like an enormous stone beehive. The passage leading to this room is 62 feet long, barely wide enough for your shoulders, and normally sealed in darkness for every hour of every day of the year. Then this morning, the solstice sunrise, a single shaft of orange light enters through a small rectangular opening above the entrance and travels the full length of the passage to illuminate the floor at your feet for exactly 17 minutes. Then it is dark again for 364 more days. This is the most famous thing about Newgrange. It has been written about for decades. In the late 1990s, researchers Aaron Watson and David Keating came to Newgrange with drums and found that something else entirely was being engineered by the same building. Newgrange was built around 3200 BCE, older than Stonehenge by 500 years, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by 600 years. Built before writing, before the wheel, before bronze tools in this part of the world, by farming communities using stone antlers and wooden levers and sustained astronomical observation across multiple generations. Watson and Keating's experiments, published in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal in 1999, revealed that the inner chamber of Newgrange generates standing acoustic waves when stimulated by rhythmic drumming at the appropriate frequency range. A standing wave is a specific physical phenomenon. It forms when sound waves moving in opposite directions through the same space interfere and create fixed zones of alternating high and low pressure. The zones do not travel. They are stable in specific locations inside the room for as long as the correct stimulus frequency is maintained. Inside the Newgrange inner chamber, Watson and Keating documented these fixed pressure zones clearly enough that people standing in different positions inside the same small room reported dramatically different physical experiences from an identical drumming event. Participants in the high-pressure zones described physical compression in the chest, pressure in the inner ear that was qualitatively distinct from normal hearing, and a sensation of the rhythm arriving from inside their own body rather than from an external source. Participants standing in the low-pressure nodes could barely perceive the same drumming that their neighbor experienced as a full-body event. The room was acoustically sorted by position. Where you stood determined what you felt. Watson and Keating also documented the passage. Its dimensions, 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, function as a low-pass filter. High frequencies entering from outside are absorbed by the stone walls. Low frequencies travel the full 62 feet and arrive at the chamber amplified relative to the filtered components. The passage strips the upper frequency spectrum and delivers the lower range, enhanced, to the room where the standing waves form. The passage is not straight. It bends slightly at a specific point. A straight passage would have been simpler to build and would not have changed the solstice light effect, which enters through the roof box above the entrance. The bend has no structural purpose. Acoustic modeling confirms it improves the low-pass filtering, ensuring a purer, lower-frequency signal reaches the inner chamber. The builders added construction complexity with no structural benefit, for a benefit that is entirely acoustic. Spiral carvings appear throughout the monument at the entrance, inside the chamber, and on dozens of curbstones. Watson proposed they represent the wave concept the builders had mastered: expanding, cycling, pressure advancing, and receding in continuous motion. The spiral is what a wave looks like if you trace it from the center outward. The builders of Newgrange may have been carving in stone the physical principle they had engineered into the building. The mainstream position is that acoustic effects at Newgrange are natural consequences of passage tomb architecture and were not primary design objectives. The bent passage has other potential explanations involving the landscape orientation. The spirals are ritual symbols whose specific meaning is unknown. But the corbelled dome of the inner chamber is not the only viable way to roof a circular room. Flat lintels would have been simpler. The dome maximizes acoustic reverberation the way modern performance hall designers curve their ceilings. On the solstice, the light entered and the standing waves formed. Who was in the high-pressure zones? What did they experience? And why did it need to last 5,000 years? Number 7. Gobekli Tepe, Turkey. From Ireland's engineered stone passage, we return to Turkey, to the oldest temple ever found, where acoustic research conducted in the last decade revealed something that the site's extraordinary age makes almost impossible to accept. Stand inside one of the excavated enclosures at Gobekli Tepe at dusk, when the tourist groups have left and the site settles into its original silence. The T-shaped limestone pillars rise around you, their carved surfaces catching the last light, animals in high relief on stones erected 11,600 years ago. The enclosure is roughly circular, 60 feet across, the pillars spaced around the inner perimeter, 2 larger central pillars facing each other across the open center. You make a sound, any sound, a clap, a shout, a sustained note. Something comes back from the arrangement of stones that is different from what you would hear making the same sound in an open field of equivalent size. The sound returns to you from all directions nearly simultaneously, concentrated, focused at the point where you are standing. In 2014, Rupert Till arrived at Gobekli Tepe with calibrated acoustic measuring equipment to find out if that difference was real and whether it was intentional. Till is a professor of music technology at the University of Huddersfield in England, who had spent years studying the acoustic properties of ancient stone monuments. His measurements inside the excavated enclosures at Gobekli Tepe documented that the circular stone arrangements create measurable acoustic focusing. The concentration of reflected sound energy toward the center of the enclosure at greater intensity than an open field of equivalent size would produce. The circular arrangement of the enclosure walls creates multiple reflection paths, all converging back toward the center from different directions nearly simultaneously. The combined effect at the center is an amplification of specific frequencies relative to what those frequencies would achieve in open air. The enclosure is a reflective array. It takes dispersed acoustic energy and returns it to a central point. The T-shaped pillars are not uniformly positioned at equal angles around the enclosure. Their flat upper faces, the horizontal crossbar of the T-shape, face inward. Till measured the specific orientation angles of these reflective surfaces relative to the center of each enclosure, the angles vary from pillar to pillar. The variation is not random. When Till modeled the acoustic consequences of the measured pillar orientations, the combined angular distribution produced more focused acoustic return at the enclosure center than uniformly distributed pillar faces would achieve. The pillars are positioned at angles that optimize the focusing effect. Achieving that optimization requires knowing, before the pillars are erected, where you want the sound to concentrate and what angles of reflection from each pillar position will produce that convergence. You have to solve the acoustic geometry before you move the stones. The knowledge precedes the construction by necessity. Till also compared the acoustic properties across multiple enclosures at the site. The excavated enclosures at Gobekli Tepe are not acoustically identical. Different enclosures produce different focusing characteristics. Till's measurements showed that the variation was systematic rather than random. Different enclosures appear to have been designed to produce distinct acoustic environments. If the pillar positioning were a matter of practical construction convenience rather than deliberate acoustic design, you would expect random variation producing inconsistent acoustic outcomes. What Till found was structured variation producing a range of distinct outcomes, as if the builders were constructing a series of spaces, each deliberately designed to sound a different way. At 11,600 years old, in the oldest known human monument, the rooms were tuned to different frequencies. Till extended the comparison to Stonehenge, Avebury, and other Neolithic stone circles, and found consistent acoustic design principles across structures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Gobekli Tepe is the earliest known example of what appears to be a widespread ancient technical tradition. Its builders are identified as hunter-gatherers who had not yet invented farming. They had no permanent villages, no pottery, no metal tools. They had acoustic engineering. The mainstream interpretation is that the circular enclosure form was chosen for symbolic or communal reasons, and that the acoustic effects are natural consequences of the geometry rather than primary design objectives. Till's research is acknowledged as documenting real acoustic properties. Whether those properties were intentionally engineered or incidentally useful remains disputed. The structured variation between enclosures could reflect changing construction practices or the work of different groups across the site's centuries of use. But the pillar face angles are not a byproduct of circular construction. A stone pillar, set upright in a circular enclosure, can face any direction. The specific inward orientation of each T-shaped pillar top required an individual decision about where to position and orient that specific stone. Each angle was chosen. The acoustic consequence of each choice would have been perceptible to anyone who spent time inside the finished enclosure. At 11,600 years ago, in a monument built before the first known civilization, someone on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey was making architectural choices about how they wanted specific rooms to sound. What were they trying to concentrate at the center of those enclosures? What sound, focused by 16-ton limestone pillars positioned at calculated angles, was the objective of an operation that required the organized labor of hundreds of hunter-gatherers with no farming surplus to sustain them? Number 8. Stonehenge, England. From Turkey's oldest acoustic temple, we move west to England's most famous stone circle, where modern acoustic modeling produced results that researchers described in their published papers as deeply unsettling. Stonehenge as it stands today is a ruin. Most of its original stones have fallen, been removed, or been taken over the last 2,000 years. Of the estimated 157 stones that once formed the complete monument, Roughly 80 remain, many toppled or leaning. But Stonehenge as a ruin is not the same thing as Stonehenge complete. What did it sound like when the outer sarsen circle was unbroken, the inner horseshoe intact, and every stone standing? Rupert Till and Bruno Fazenda, acoustic engineers at the University of Salford, set out to answer this question with precision. Unable to reconstruct the full monument, they built a 1/12 scale model, recreating the dimensions and material properties of every original stone. They tested its acoustic behavior with miniature speakers and microphones calibrated to scale, then applied the mathematical laws governing acoustic scaling to convert the results to full-size equivalents. What they found warranted 2 separate published papers and language in those papers that acoustic researchers rarely use. The results surprised them. The complete Stonehenge produced 3 documented acoustic properties, none of which exists in the ruin that visitors walk through today. The first was the cocktail party effect at monumental scale. When multiple simultaneous sound sources operated inside the complete monument, the reflection pattern from the surrounding sarsen uprights and lintels created a dense acoustic wash in which individual sources became impossible to isolate directionally. 100 people chanting inside the complete Stonehenge would not have sounded like 100 people in an open field. The reflections from the unbroken stone circle would have blurred them into a single ambient presence. Sound from everywhere and from nowhere, immersive and disorienting. All individual spatial identity dissolved into a collective voice that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves. No one in that acoustic field could have told you where any particular sound was coming from. They could only have told you that it was coming from everywhere at once. The second property was more precise and more disturbing. The acoustic modeling identified specific standing positions inside the monument where the cocktail party effect reversed itself. At these positions, a single voice became disproportionately clear against the ambient wash. A person standing at one of these acoustic sweet spots could be heard distinctly by the assembled crowd, while the crowd could not locate the direction of the voice. The sound appeared to originate from the space rather than from a specific person. The sweet spots were not distributed evenly around the interior. They occurred at specific locations that correspond to the monument's primary astronomical sightlines. The summer solstice sunrise axis at Stonehenge runs from the center of the monument, through the gap between the inner trilithons, past the slaughter stone, and toward the heel stone to the northeast, the direction from which the midsummer sun rises each June 21st. This axis, which is the single most important alignment in the monument, and the one that required the most precise engineering to achieve, passes through one of the acoustic sweet spots identified in Till and Fazenda's modeling. A person standing on the solstice axis at the center of Stonehenge, at the moment of midsummer sunrise, would have stood at a position where their voice projected clearly outward through the acoustic wash of the assembled crowd, while that crowd could not locate where the voice was coming from. Once a year, on the most significant morning in the ceremonial calendar, there was one position inside Stonehenge from which a single person could address thousands and appear to speak from the air itself. Whoever held that position held something more than a vantage point. Third, infrasound. Sarsen stone vibrates under wind or percussion at 17 to 19 Hz, below the threshold of conscious hearing. Sustained infrasound in this range is documented in peer-reviewed neuroscience to produce unexplained anxiety, a persistent sense of an unseen presence, and involuntary eye vibration that in low-light conditions creates the perception of movement at the visual field's periphery. Stonehenge, complete and windswept, would have generated infrasound, producing all of these effects in any human being inside the circle. The builders transported bluestone from Wales, 250 miles away, past locally available stone that would have served every structural purpose. Bluestone rings tonally when struck. Sarsen resonates at infrasound frequencies under wind and percussion. Together they produce the acoustic environment Till and Fazenda modeled. The builders selected their materials at extraordinary logistical cost from specific sources where the stones behave acoustically the way complete Stonehenge behaves acoustically. Can the culture that moved 250 miles of stone and engineered an astronomical alignment within a fraction of a degree also be plausibly credited with not knowing what it would sound like? Who stood in the sweet spot on the solstice morning? What were they saying to a crowd that could not locate where their voice was coming from? And why did establishing the authority to say it require stones from 250 miles away? Number 9. Nan Madol, Micronesia. From England's Stone Acoustic Theatre, we cross the Pacific Ocean to a city built entirely on water, where the walls don't just shape sound but generate it on their own, and where the sounds have been given proper names by the people who live close enough to hear them. You know the construction story. 92 artificial islands assembled on a coral reef lagoon off the eastern coast of Pohnpei, covering 185 acres, built from an estimated 750,000 tons of columnar basalt, transported across open water, without metal tools or wheeled vehicles, stacked in interlocking log cabin configurations to form perimeter walls rising 25 feet above the waterline. The engineering mystery of Nan Madol is real and well documented, and has been covered in documentaries and archaeology texts for decades. Here is what those sources consistently omit. On still nights, particularly in the hours before dawn when the day-to-night temperature differential is at its maximum, the basalt walls of Nan Madol produce low, slow, irregular sounds. Not the sound of ocean swells against stone, not wind across the lagoon. The walls themselves emit tones. The Pohnpeian people who live across the water from the site have named these sounds. They call them the voices of the ancestors. This is not a recent cultural interpretation applied to a newly observed phenomenon. The voices have been the voices of the ancestors since before any written record of Nan Madol exists. The site is avoided at night by most local people. Whatever is speaking from the stone walls after dark, generations of Pohnpeians have consistent views about its nature and about the wisdom of engaging with it in the dark. Columnar basalt undergoes significant dimensional change with temperature. Each column expands in the heat and contracts at night. In contact with adjacent columns of slightly different thermal mass, the different contraction rates cause minute relative movement at contact surfaces. A microscopic tick, inaudible in isolation. But Nan Madol is 750,000 tons of interlocked basalt, all cooling simultaneously, all shifting against each other at slightly different rates because no two columns are thermally identical. The micro-movement sounds compound across the entire mass. Individually inaudible, collectively audible. The architectural configuration amplifies this. The walls of Nan Madol are not solid basalt. They are built in a hollow core style, with columnar basalt stacked so that regular air gaps exist between adjacent columns, creating a porous wall with enclosed air cavities distributed along its length. A wall with regular internal air cavities is, acoustically, a resonance structure. Specific frequencies of the thermal micro-movement sounds that the basalt generates are amplified by these resonance cavities, while others are suppressed. The result is that the baseline thermal acoustic noise of 750,000 tons of cooling basalt is filtered and concentrated into specific audible tonal events. Different wall sections have different cavity configurations and produce different characteristic sounds. Moving through Nan Madol in the hours before dawn, the sounds change as you move. The city has a spatial acoustic signature at night, different areas speaking different tones as their specific basalt configurations cool at different rates. The mainstream position is that this is a natural acoustic byproduct of the basalt's thermal behavior, a physically interesting phenomenon whose cultural meaning, the ancestral voices interpretation, is a Pohnpeian tradition rather than a physical fact. The sounds are real, their cause is identified, their meaning is culturally constructed. But the builders of Nan Madol chose columnar basalt for all 92 islands when other stone was available on Pohnpei without the logistical cost of water transport. Other stone would have served every structural purpose of wall construction. The hollow core style, which creates the resonance cavities that produce the amplified night sounds, was not the only viable technique for building walls this height. Solid core stacking would have been structurally equivalent. The hollow core style added construction complexity, required more careful placement of each column, and produced no structural advantage. It did produce the resonance cavities. And the Saudilur dynasty, which ruled Pohnpei from Nan Madol for centuries, held political authority that was inseparable from their identification with the sacred city and its ancestral presence. Their legitimacy rested on their connection to a place where the ancestors spoke. Control of the sacred city meant control of the voices, and control of the voices meant control of everything. If you quarry basalt, transport it across open ocean, and build 92 islands from it over generations, you know what basalt does at night. The thermal behavior of stone is not an abstract property. Anyone who has camped near basalt outcrops or worked with basalt in any sustained way knows that it sounds different at night than during the day. The builders of Nan Madol knew their city would speak after dark. The hollow core construction that amplifies those sounds was a deliberate architectural choice. The ancestral voices that legitimized the Saudalir dynasty were not an accident discovered after construction was complete. They were designed in, built into every hollow cavity in every wall across all 92 islands. And the walls are still there. The basalt is still cooling every night across the lagoon. Tonight, in the hours before the temperature turns back toward morning, the voices of the ancestors are still performing their function in a city built to make them speak. Number 10. The Longyou Caves, China. From Nan Madol's speaking walls, we cross the Pacific one more time to China, where the strangest acoustic discovery in this list was made not by archaeologists, not by acoustic researchers, but by a farmer draining a pond, and only confirmed by researchers who repeated their measurements multiple times because they did not believe what their instruments were showing. In 1992, a farmer in Longyou County, Zhejiang Province, began pumping water from a pond. He pumped for 3 weeks before the water was gone, and he was looking at a stone staircase descending into a carved cavern with 30-foot ceilings. He had found one. Researchers eventually identified 36, carved from siltstone bedrock and interconnected across nearly 7.5 acres. The estimated total rock removed is approximately 35 million cubic feet, equivalent in mass to the Great Pyramid of Giza. No debris field, no rubble pile of any kind exists anywhere above the caves. 35 million cubic feet of removed rock left no trace. Neither did the builders. China has kept continuous written records for approximately 3,000 years. The Qin dynasty that unified China in 221 BCE documented infrastructure projects of far smaller scale than this. The Han dynasty that followed maintained meticulous administrative records. If the Longyou Caves were carved at any point from the Qin period onward, they would have been the largest single construction project in the region by a margin so large as to be impossible to overlook. They appear in no imperial document, no provincial chronicle, no local administrative record, no folk legend, no oral tradition of any kind. The farmers who owned the land above these caverns for generations had no knowledge they existed below them. Researchers studying the caves after their 1992 discovery noted the chisel marks immediately. Every surface inside the caverns, ceilings, walls, and floors is covered in parallel chisel marks, cut at consistent angles, ranging from 60 to 85 degrees relative to the surface plane. The marks run in uniform rows, evenly spaced, covering every square foot of every carved surface across all 36 caves in a pattern so consistent that it suggests either a single organized workforce following a precise technical specification or the careful transmission of that specification across multiple work teams operating in different locations. Archaeologists initially interpreted the marks as quarrying technique. Then acoustic researchers began measuring. The acoustic property that caused researchers to doubt their instruments was uniformity. In any enclosed space, measurements at different positions produce different results. The geometry changes as you move. Every position produces a distinct reverberation pattern and frequency response. This is fundamental to how enclosed spaces work. Inside the Longyou Caves, the measurements were nearly identical regardless of position. Different standing points in the same cave produce the same reverberation time and frequency response. Different caves produce the same results as each other. 36 separate caverns, distributed beneath different ponds and fields, all sounding the same from any position inside any of them. The chisel marks are the mechanism. Parallel grooves at consistent angles scatter sound waves, striking a surface across a wide range of reflection angles and arrival times, rather than reflecting them as a single coherent beam. This dispersal smooths out the acoustic differences that normally exist between positions in an enclosed space. The technical term for a surface engineered to achieve this is an acoustic diffuser. Acoustic diffuser panels are standard components of professional recording studios and performance halls, designed using mathematical wave scattering models to produce even sound distribution. They use angled surfaces for exactly the physical reasons the Longyou chisel marks produce the measured uniformity. The specific angle range, 60 to 85 degrees, falls within the range acoustic engineers today target for diffusers, designed for the human voice frequency range. The people who carved the Longyou Caves covered every surface across 36 chambers with acoustic diffuser panels made of stone and then removed all evidence they had ever existed. The mainstream interpretation dates the caves to somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 3,000 years ago and offers storage, quarrying, or military shelter as possible functions. None of these explanations account for the acoustic engineering. Quarries leave debris, storage facilities leave artifacts, military shelters appear in administrative records, especially for a civilization as documentation-obsessed as ancient China. None of those traces exist here. Quarries do not build diffuser panels into their walls. Storage facilities do not require 36 acoustically identical rooms. The function of the Longyou Caves, formally speaking, remains undetermined. Tensite. 4 continents. 11,000 years between the oldest and the most recently built. Malta, Scotland, Peru, Egypt, Mexico, Ireland, Turkey, England, Micronesia, China. Every one of them raised walls that produce sounds mainstream science has confirmed are real, documented, and cannot yet be fully explained. These 10 places represent a thread in human history that has been hiding inside walls, in frequencies below the threshold of casual attention, in the stone that generations of researchers have measured for every property except the one that mattered. If these acoustic properties were accidental, the coincidence spans continents and millennia, and a consistency of purpose that has no other explanation. If they were deliberate, then the builders of the ancient world understood things about sound and the human nervous system that we are only now developing the instruments to rediscover. Subscribe and you will not miss the next investigation into what has been hiding in the stones. If this reached you, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We want to know where the curious ones are.